Chapter 2. Know Thy Time. Most discussions of the executive's task start with the advice to plan one's work. This sounds eminently plausible. The only thing wrong with it is that it rarely works. The plans always remain on paper, always remain good intentions. They seldom turn into achievement. Effective executives, in my observation, don't start with their tasks. They start with their time, and they don't start out with planning. They start by finding out where their time actually goes, then they attempt to manage their time and to cut back unproductive demands on their time. Finally, they consolidate their discretionary time into the largest possible continuing units. This three-step process is as follows. Recording time, managing time, and consolidating time is the foundation of executive effectiveness. Effective executives know that time is the limiting factor. The output limits of any process are set by the scarcest resource. In the process we call accomplishment, this is time. Time is also a unique resource. Of the other major resources, money is actually quite plentiful. We long ago should have learned that it is the demand for capital rather than the supply thereof which sets the limit to economic growth and activity. People, the third limiting resource, one can hire, though one can rarely hire enough good people, but one cannot rent, hire, buy, or otherwise obtain more time. The supply of time is totally inelastic. No matter how high the demand, the supply won't go up. There's no price for it and no marginal utility curve for it. Moreover, time is totally perishable and can't be stored. Yesterday's time is gone forever and will never come back. Time is therefore always in exceedingly short supply. Time is totally irreplaceable. Within limits, we can substitute one resource for another, copper for aluminum, for instance. We can substitute capital for human labor. We can use more knowledge or more brawn, but there's no substitute for time. Everything requires time. It's the one truly universal condition. All work takes place in time and uses up time. Yet most people take for granted this unique, irreplaceable, and necessary resource. Nothing else perhaps distinguishes effective executives as much as their tender, loving care of time. Man is ill-equipped to manage his time. Though man, like all living beings, has a biological clock, as anyone discovers who crosses the Atlantic by jet, he lacks a reliable time sense, as psychological experiments have shown. People kept in a room in which they can't see light and darkness outside rapidly lose all sense of time. Even in total darkness, most people retain their sense of space, but even with the lights on, a few hours in a sealed room make most people incapable of estimating how much time has elapsed. They're as likely to underrate grossly the time spent in the room as to overrate it grossly. If we rely on our memory, therefore, we don't know how time has been spent. I sometimes ask executives who pride themselves on their memory to put down their guess as to how they spend their own time. Then I lock these guesses away for a few weeks or months. In the meantime, the executives run an actual time record on themselves. There's never much resemblance between the way these men thought they used their time and their actual records. One company chairman was absolutely certain that he divided his time roughly into 3 parts. 1/3 he thought he was spending with his senior men, 1/3 he thought he spent with his important customers, and 1/3 he thought was devoted to community activities. The actual record of his activities over 6 weeks brought out clearly that he spent almost no time in any of these areas. These were the tasks on which he knew he should spend time, and therefore memory, obliging as usual, told him that these were the tasks on which he actually had spent his time. The record showed, however, that he spent most of his hours as a kind of dispatcher, keeping track of orders from customers he personally knew, and bothering the plant with telephone calls about them. Most of these orders were going through all right anyhow, and his intervention could only delay them, but when his secretary first came in with the time record, he didn't believe her. It took 2 or 3 more time logs to convince him that record, rather than memory, has to be trusted when it comes to the use of time. The effective executive therefore knows that to manage his time, he first has to know where it actually goes. The time demands on the executive. There are constant pressures toward unproductive and wasteful time use. Any executive, whether he's a manager or not, has to spend a great deal of his time on things that don't contribute at all. Much is inevitably wasted. The higher up in the organization he is, the more demands on his time will the organization make. The head of a large company once told me that in 2 years as chief executive officer he had eaten out every evening except on Christmas Day and New Year's Day. All the other dinners were official functions, each of which wasted several hours, yet he saw no possible alternative. Whether the dinner honored an employee retiring after 50 years of service or the governor of one of the states in which the company did business, the chief executive officer had to be there. Ceremony is one of his tasks. My friend had no illusions that these dinners contributed anything either to the company or to his own entertainment or self-development, yet he had to be there and dine graciously. Similar time wasters abound in the life of every executive. When a company's best customer calls up, the sales manager can't say, "I'm busy." He has to listen, even though all the customer wants to talk about may be a bridge game the preceding Saturday or the chances of his daughters getting into the right college. The hospital administrator has to attend the meetings of every one of his staff committees, or else the physicians, the nurses, the technicians, and so on feel that they're being slighted. The government administrator had better pay attention when a congressman calls and wants some information he could in less time get out of the telephone book or the World Almanac, and so it goes all day long. Non-managers are no better off. They too are bombarded with demands on their time which add little, if anything, to their productivity and yet can't be disregarded. In every executive job, a large part of the time must therefore be wasted on things which, though they apparently have to be done, contribute nothing or little. Yet most of the tasks of the executive require, for minimum effectiveness, a fairly large quantum of time. To spend in one stretch less than this minimum is sheer waste. One accomplishes nothing and has to begin all over again. To write a report may, for instance, require 6 or 8 hours at least for the first draft. It's pointless to give 7 hours to the task by spending 15 minutes twice a day for 3 weeks. All one has at the end is blank paper with some doodles on it. But if one can lock the door, disconnect the telephone, and sit down to wrestle with a report for 5 or 6 hours without interruption, one has a good chance to come up with what I call a zero draft, the one before the first draft. From then on, one can indeed work in fairly small installments, can rewrite, correct, and edit section by section, paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence. The same goes for an experiment. One simply has to have 5 to 12 hours in a single stretch to set up the apparatus and to do at least one completed run, or one has to start all over again after an interruption. To be effective, every knowledge worker, and especially every executive, therefore needs to be able to dispose of time in fairly large chunks. To have small dribs and drabs of time at his disposal won't be sufficient, even if the total is an impressive number of hours. This is particularly true with respect to time spent working with people, which is of course a central task in the work of the executive. People are time consumers, and most people are time wasters. To spend a few minutes with people is simply not productive. If one wants to get anything across, one has to spend a fairly large minimum quantum of time. The manager who thinks he can discuss the plans, direction, and performance of one of his subordinates in 15 minutes, and many managers believe this, is just deceiving himself. If one wants to get to the point of having an impact, one needs probably at least an hour and usually much more. And if one wants to establish a human relationship, one needs infinitely more time. Relations with other knowledge workers are especially time-consuming. Whatever the reason, whether it's the absence of the barrier of class and authority between superior and subordinate in knowledge work, or whether he simply takes himself more seriously, the knowledge worker makes much greater time demands than the manual worker on his superior as well as on his associates. Moreover, because knowledge work can't be measured the way manual work can, one can't tell a knowledge worker in a few simple words whether he's doing the right job and how well he's doing it. One can say to a manual worker, "Our work standard calls for 50 pieces an hour and you're only turning out 42. One has to sit down with a knowledge worker and think through with him what should be done and why before one can even know whether he's doing a satisfactory job or not, and this is time-consuming. Since the knowledge worker directs himself, he must understand what achievement is expected of him and why. He must also understand the work of the people who have to use his knowledge output. For this, he needs a good deal of information, discussion, instruction, all things that take time, and contrary to common belief, this time demand is made not only on his superior, but equally on his colleagues. The knowledge worker must be focused on the results and performance goals of the entire organization to have any results and performance at all. This means that he has to set aside time to direct his vision from his work to results, and from his specialty to the outside, in which alone performance lies. Wherever knowledge workers perform well in large organizations, senior executives take time out on a regular schedule to sit down with them, sometimes all the way down to green juniors, and ask, "What should we at the head of this organization know about your work? What do you want to tell me regarding this organization? Where do you see opportunities we don't exploit? Where do you see dangers to which we're still blind? And altogether, what do you want to know from me about the organization? This leisurely exchange is needed equally in a government agency and in a business, in a research lab and in an army staff. Without it, the knowledge people either lose enthusiasm and become time servers, or they direct their energies toward their specialty and away from the opportunities and needs of the organization. But such a session takes a great deal of time, especially as it should be unhurried and relaxed. People must feel that we have all the time in the world. This actually means that one gets a great deal done fast, but it means also that one has to make available a good deal of time in one chunk and without too much interruption. Mixing personal relations and work relations is time-consuming. If hurried, it turns into friction, yet any organization rests on this mixture. The more people are together, the more time will their sheer interaction take, the less time will be available to them for work, accomplishment, and results. Management literature has long known the theorem of the span of control, which asserts that one man can manage only a few people if these people have to come together in their own work, that is, for instance, an accountant, a sales manager, and a manufacturing man, all three of whom have to work with each other to get any results. On the other hand, managers of chain stores in different cities don't have to work with each other, so that any number could conceivably report to one regional vice president without violating the principle of the span of control. Whether this theorem is valid or not, there's little doubt that the more people have to work together, the more time will be spent on interacting rather than on work and accomplishment. Large organization creates strength by lavishly using the executive's time. The larger the organization, therefore, the less actual time will the executive have. The more important will it be for him to know where his time goes and to manage the little time at his disposal. The more people there are in an organization, the more often does a decision on people arise, but fast personnel decisions are likely to be the wrong decisions. The time quantum of the good personnel decision is amazingly large. What the decision involves often becomes clear only when one has gone around the same track several times. Among the effective executives I've had occasion to observe, there have been people who make decisions fast and people who make them rather slowly, but without exception, they make personnel decisions slowly, and they make them several times before they really commit themselves. Alfred P. Sloan, Jr., former head of General Motors, the world's largest manufacturing company, was reported never to make a personnel decision the first time it came up. He made a tentative judgment, and even that took several hours as a rule. Then, a few days or weeks later, he tackled the question again as if he had never worked on it before. Only when he came up with the same name 2 or 3 times in a row was he willing to go ahead. Sloan had a deserved reputation for the winners he picked, but when asked about his secret, he's reported to have said, "No secret. I have simply accepted that the first name I come up with is likely to be the wrong name, and I therefore retrace the whole process of thought and analysis a few times before I act." Yet Sloan was far from a patient man. Few executives make personnel decisions of such impact, but all effective executives I have had occasion to observe have learned that they have to give several hours of continuous and uninterrupted thought to decisions on people if they hope to come up with the right answer. The director of a medium-sized government research institute found this out when one of his senior administrators had to be removed from his job. The man was in his 50s and had been with the institute all his working life. After years of good work, the man suddenly began to deteriorate. He clearly could no longer handle his job, but even if civil service rules had permitted it, the man couldn't be fired. He could, of course, have been demoted, but this, the director felt, would destroy the man, and the institute owed him consideration and loyalty for years of productive, loyal service. Yet he couldn't be kept in an administrative position. His shortcomings were much too obvious and were indeed weakening the whole institute. The director and his deputy had been over this situation many times without seeing a way out, but when they sat down for a quiet evening where they could give 3 or 4 hours uninterruptedly to the problem, the obvious solution finally emerged. It was indeed so simple that neither could explain why he had not seen it before. It got the man out of the wrong job into a job which needed being done, and which yet did not require the administrative performance he was no longer able to give. Time in large, continuous, and uninterrupted units is needed for such decisions as whom to put on a task force set up to study a specific problem, what responsibilities to entrust to the manager of a new organizational unit or to the new manager of an old organizational unit, whether to promote into a vacancy a man who has the marketing knowledge needed for the job but lacks technical training, or whether to put in a first-rate technical man without much marketing background, and so on. People decisions are time-consuming, for the simple reason that the Lord didn't create people as resources for organization. They don't come in the proper size and shape for the tasks that have to be done in organization, and they can't be machined down or recast for these tasks. People are always almost fits at best. To get the work done with people, and no other resources available, therefore requires lots of time, thought, and judgment. The Slavic peasant of Eastern Europe used to have a proverb, "What one does not have in one's feet, one's got to have in one's head." This may be considered a fanciful version of the law of the conservation of energy, but it's above all something like a law of the conservation of time. The more time we take out of the task of the legs, that is, of physical manual work, the more we'll have to spend on the work of the head, that is, on knowledge work. The easier we make it for rank-and-file workers, machine tenders as well as clerks, the more will have to be done by the knowledge worker. One cannot take knowledge out of the work. It has to be put back somewhere, and in much larger and cohesive amounts. Time demands on the knowledge workers aren't going down. Machine tenders now only work 40 hours a week, and soon may work only 35 and live better than anybody ever lived before, no matter how much he worked or how rich he was. But the machine tender's leisure is inescapably being paid for by the knowledge worker's longer hours. It's not the executives who have a problem of spending their leisure time in the industrial countries of the world today. On the contrary, they are working everywhere longer hours and have greater demands on their time to satisfy, and the executive time scarcity is bound to become worse rather than better. One important reason for this is that a high standard of living presupposes an economy of innovation and change, but innovation and change make inordinate time demands on the executive. All one can think and do in a short time is to think what one already knows and to do as one has always done. There's been an enormous amount of discussion lately to explain why the British economy has lagged so badly since World War II. One of the reasons is surely that the British businessmen of the older generation tried to have it as easy as his workers and to work the same short hours. But this is possible only if the business or the industry clings to the old established routine and shuns innovation and change. For all these reasons, the demands of the organization, the demands of people, the time demands of change and innovation, it will become increasingly important for executives to be able to manage their time. But one cannot even think of managing one's time unless one first knows where it goes. Time diagnosis. That one has to record time before one can know where it goes and before, in turn, one can attempt to manage it, we've realized for the best part of a century. That is, we've known this in respect to manual work, skilled and unskilled, since scientific management around 1900 began to record the time it takes for a specific piece of manual work to be done. Hardly any country is today so far behind in industrial methods as not to time systematically the operations of manual workers. We have applied this knowledge to the work where time doesn't greatly matter, that is, where the difference between time use and time waste is primarily efficiency and costs, but we haven't applied it to the work that matters increasingly, and that particularly has to cope with time, the work of the knowledge worker and especially of the executive. Here the difference between time use and time waste is effectiveness and results. The first step toward executive effectiveness is therefore to record actual time use. The specific method in which the record is put together need not concern us here. There are executives who keep such a time log themselves. Others, such as the company chairman just mentioned, have their secretaries do it for them. The important thing is that it gets done and that the record is made in real time, that is, at the time of the event itself, rather than later on from memory. A good many effective executives keep such a log continuously and look at it regularly every month. At a minimum, effective executives have the log run on themselves for 3 to 4 weeks at a stretch, twice a year or so, on a regular schedule. After each such sample, they rethink and rework their schedule, but 6 months later they invariably find that they have drifted into wasting their time on trivia. Time use does improve with practice, but only constant efforts at managing time can prevent drifting. Systematic time management is therefore the next step. One has to find the non-productive, time-wasting activities and get rid of them if one possibly can. This requires asking oneself a number of diagnostic questions. 1. First, one tries to identify and eliminate the things that need not be done at all. the things that are purely waste of time without any results whatever. To find these time wastes, one asks of all activities in the time records, what would happen if this weren't done at all? And if the answer is nothing would happen, then obviously the conclusion is to stop doing it. It's amazing how many things busy people are doing that never will be missed. There are, for instance, the countless speeches, dinners, committee memberships, and directorships which take an unconscionable toll of the time of busy people, which are rarely enjoyed by them or done well by them, but which are endured year in and year out as an Egyptian plague ordained from on high. Actually, all one has to do is to learn to say no if an activity contributes nothing to one's own organization, to oneself, or to the organization for which it's to be performed. The chief executive I was talking about, who had to dine out every night, found when he analyzed these dinners that at least 1/3 would proceed just as well without anyone from the company's senior management. In fact, he found, somewhat to his chagrin, that his acceptance of a good many of these invitations was by no means welcome to his hosts. They had invited him as a polite gesture, but they had fully expected to be turned down and didn't quite know what to do with him when he accepted. I have yet to see an executive, regardless of rank or station, who couldn't consign something like 1/4 of the demands on his time to the wastepaper basket without anybody's noticing their disappearance. 2. The next question is, which of the activities on my time log could be done by somebody else just as well, if not better? The dinner-eating company chairman found that any senior executive of the company would do for another 1/3 of the formal dinners. All the occasion demanded was the company's name on the guest list. There has been for years a great deal of talk about delegation in management. Every manager, whatever the organization, business, government, university, or armed service, has been exhorted to be a better delegator. In fact, most managers in large organizations have themselves given this sermon, and more than once. I have yet to see any results from all this preaching. The reason why no one listens is simple. As usually presented, delegation makes little sense. If it means that somebody else ought to do part of my work, it's wrong. One is paid for doing one's own work, and if it implies, as the usual sermon does, that the laziest manager is the best manager, it's not only nonsense, it's immoral. But I have never seen an executive confronted with his time record who didn't rapidly acquire the habit of pushing at other people everything that he need not do personally. The first look at the time record makes it abundantly clear that there just isn't time enough to do the things the executive himself considers important, himself wants to do, and is himself committed to doing. The only way he can get to the important things is by pushing on others anything that can be done by them at all. A good example is executive travel. Professor C. Northcote Parkinson has pointed out in one of his delightful satires that the quickest way to get rid of an inconvenient superior is to make a world traveler out of him. The jet plane is indeed overrated as a management tool. A great many trips have to be made, but a junior can make most of them. Travel is still a novelty for him. He's still young enough to get a good night's rest in hotel beds. The junior can take the fatigue, and he'll therefore also do a better job than the more experienced, perhaps better trained, but tired superior. There are also the meetings one attends, even though nothing is going to happen that someone else couldn't handle. There are the hours spent discussing a document before there's even a first draft that can be discussed. There's, in the research lab, the time spent by a senior physicist to write a popular news release on some of his work, yet there are plenty of people around with enough science to understand what the physicist is trying to say, who can write readable English, where the physicist only speaks higher mathematics. Altogether, an enormous amount of the work being done by executives is work that can easily be done by others, and therefore should be done by others. Delegation, as the term is customarily used, is a misunderstanding, is indeed misdirection. But getting rid of anything that can be done by somebody else so that one does not have to delegate, but can really get to one's own work, that's a major improvement in effectiveness. 3. A common cause of time waste is largely under the executive's control and can be eliminated by him. That's the time of others he himself wastes. There's no one symptom for this, but there's still a simple way to find out. That's to ask other people. Effective executives have learned to ask systematically and without coyness, what do I do that wastes your time without contributing to your effectiveness? To ask this question and to ask it without being afraid of the truth is a mark of the effective executive. The manner in which an executive does productive work may still be a major waste of somebody else's time. The senior financial executive of a large organization knew perfectly well that the meetings in his office wasted a lot of time. This man asked all his direct subordinates to every meeting, whatever the topic. As a result, the meetings were far too large, and because every participant felt that he had to show interest, everybody asked at least one question, most of them irrelevant. As a result, the meetings stretched on endlessly, but the senior executive hadn't known until he asked that his subordinates too considered the meetings a waste of their time. Aware of the great importance everyone in the organization placed on status and on being in the know, he had feared that the uninvited men would feel slighted and left out. Now, however, he satisfies the status needs of his subordinates in a different manner. He sends out a printed form which reads, "I have asked Messrs. Smith, Jones, and Robinson to meet with me Wednesday at 3 in the 4th floor conference room to discuss next year's capital appropriations budget, for example. Please come if you think that you need the information or want to take part in the discussion, but you'll in any event receive right away a full summary of the discussion and of any decisions reached, together with a request for your comments." Where formerly a dozen people came and stayed all afternoon, 3 men and a secretary to take the notes now get the matter over with within an hour or so, and no one feels left out. Many executives know all about these unproductive and unnecessary time demands, yet they're afraid to prune them. They're afraid to cut out something important by mistake, but this mistake, if made, can be speedily corrected. If one prunes too harshly, one usually finds out fast enough. Every new president of the United States accepts too many invitations at first. Then it dawns on him that he has other work to do and that most of these invitations don't add to his effectiveness. Thereupon he usually cuts back too sharply and becomes inaccessible. A few weeks or months later, however, he's being told by the press and the radio that he's losing touch. Then he usually finds the right balance between being exploited without effectiveness and using public appearances as his national pulpit. In fact, there's not much risk that an executive will cut back too much. We usually tend to overrate rather than underrate our importance and to conclude that far too many things can only be done by ourselves. Even very effective executives still do a great many unnecessary, unproductive things. But the best proof that the danger of over-pruning is a bugaboo is the extraordinary effectiveness so often attained by severely ill or severely handicapped people. A good example was Harry Hopkins, President Roosevelt's confidential advisor in World War II. A dying, indeed almost a dead man for whom every step was torment, he could only work a few hours every other day or so. This forced him to cut out everything but truly vital matters. He didn't lose effectiveness thereby. On the contrary, he became, as Churchill called him once, Lord Heart of the Matter, and accomplished more than anyone else in wartime Washington. This is an extreme, of course, but it illustrates both how much control one can exercise over one's time if one really tries, and how much of the time wasters one can cut out without loss of effectiveness. Pruning the time wasters. The following 3 diagnostic questions deal with unproductive and time-consuming activities over which every executive has some control. Every knowledge worker and every executive should ask them. Managers, however, need to be equally concerned with time loss that results from poor management and deficient organization. Poor management wastes everybody's time, but above all it wastes the manager's time. 1. The first task here is to identify the time wasters which follow from lack of system or foresight. The symptom to look for is the recurrent crisis, the crisis that comes back year after year. A crisis that recurs a second time is a crisis that mustn't occur again. The annual inventory crisis belongs here, that with the computer we now can meet it even more heroically and at greater expense than we could in the past is hardly a great improvement. A recurrent crisis should always have been foreseen. It can therefore either be prevented or reduced to a routine which clerks can manage. The definition of a routine is that it makes unskilled people without judgment capable of doing what it took near genius to do before, for a routine puts down in systematic step-by-step form what a very able man learned in surmounting yesterday's crisis. The recurrent crisis isn't confined to the lower levels of an organization. It afflicts everyone. For years, a fairly large company ran into one of these crises annually around the 1st of December. In a highly seasonal business, with the last quarter usually the year's low, 4th quarter sales and profits weren't easily predictable. Every year, however, management made an earnings prediction when it issued its interim report at the end of the 2nd quarter.
3 months later, in the fourth quarter, there was tremendous scurrying and company-wide emergency action to live up to top management's forecast. For 3 to 5 weeks, nobody in the management group got any work done. It took only one stroke of the pen to solve this crisis. Instead of predicting a definite year-end figure, top management is now predicting results within a range.
This fully satisfies directors, stockholders, and the financial community, and what used to be a crisis a few years ago now is no longer even noticed in the company, yet fourth quarter results are quite a bit better than they used to be, since executive time is no longer being wasted on making results fit the forecast. Prior to Mr. McNamara's appointment as Secretary of Defense, a similar last-minute crisis shook the entire American defense establishment every spring toward the end of the fiscal year on June 30th. Every manager in the defense establishment, military or civilian, tried desperately in May and June to find expenditures for the money appropriated by Congress for the fiscal year. Otherwise, he was afraid he would have to give back the money. This last-minute spending spree has also been a chronic disease in Russian planning, and yet this crisis was totally unnecessary, as Mr. McNamara immediately saw. The law had always permitted the placing of unspent but needed sums into an interim account. The recurrent crisis is simply a symptom of slovenliness and laziness. Years ago, when I first started out as a consultant, I had to learn how to tell a well-managed industrial plant from a poorly managed one without any pretense to production knowledge. A well-managed plant, I soon learned, is a quiet place, a factory that is dramatic, a factory in which the epic of industry is unfolded before the visitor's eyes, is poorly managed. A well-managed factory is boring. Nothing exciting happens in it because the crises have been anticipated and have been converted into routine. Similarly, a well-managed organization is a dull organization. The dramatic things in such an organization are basic decisions that make the future, rather than heroics in mopping up yesterday. 2. Time wastes often result from overstaffing. My first-grade arithmetic primer asked, if it takes 2 ditch diggers 2 days to dig a ditch, how long would it take 4 ditch diggers? In first grade, the correct answer is, of course, 1 day. In the kind of work, however, with which executives are concerned, the right answer is probably 4 days, if not forever. A workforce may indeed be too small for the task, and the work then suffers if it gets done at all, but this isn't the rule. Much more common is the workforce that's too big for effectiveness, the workforce that spends, therefore, an increasing amount of its time interacting rather than working. There's a fairly reliable symptom of overstaffing if the senior people in the group, and of course the manager in particular, spend more than a small fraction of their time, maybe 1/10, on problems of human relations, on feuds and frictions, on jurisdictional disputes and questions of cooperation and so on, then the workforce is almost certainly too large. People get into each other's way. People have become an impediment to performance rather than the means thereto. In a lean organization, people have room to move without colliding with one another and can do their work without having to explain it all the time. The excuse for overstaffing is always, but we have to have a thermodynamicist or a patent lawyer or an economist on the staff. This specialist isn't being used much, he may not be used at all, but we have to have him around just in case we need him. And he always has to be familiar with our problem and be part of the group from the start. One should only have on a team the knowledges and skills that are needed day in and day out for the bulk of the work. Specialists that may be needed once in a while or that may have to be consulted on this or on that should always remain outside. It's infinitely cheaper to go to them and consult them against a fee than to have them in the group, to say nothing of the impact an underemployed but overskilled man has on the effectiveness of the entire group. All he can do is mischief.
3. Another common time waster is malorganization. Its symptom is an excess of meetings. Meetings are by definition a concession to deficient organization, for one either meets or one works. One cannot do both at the same time. In an ideally designed structure, which in a changing world is of course only a dream, there would be no meetings. Everybody would know what he needs to know to do his job. Everyone would have the resources available to him to do his job. We meet because people holding different jobs have to cooperate to get a specific task done. We meet because the knowledge and experience needed in a specific situation aren't available in one head, but have to be pieced together out of the experience and knowledge of several people.
There will always be more than enough meetings. Organization will always require so much working together that the attempts of well-meaning behavioral scientists to create opportunities for cooperation may be somewhat redundant, but if executives in an organization spend more than a fairly small part of their time in meeting, it's a sure sign of malorganization. Every meeting generates a host of little follow-up meetings, some formal, some informal, but both stretching out for hours. Meetings therefore need to be purposefully directed. An undirected meeting is not just a nuisance, it's a danger. But above all, meetings have to be the exception rather than the rule. An organization in which everybody meets all the time is an organization in which no one gets anything done. Wherever a time log shows the fatty degeneration of meetings, whenever, for instance, people in an organization find themselves in meetings a quarter of their time or more, there's time-wasting malorganization. There are exceptions, special organs whose purpose it is to meet. The boards of directors, for instance, of such companies as DuPont and Standard Oil of New Jersey, which are the final organs of deliberation and appeal, but which don't operate anything. But as these two companies realized a long time ago, the people who sit on these boards can't be permitted to do anything else, for the same reason, by the way, that judges can't be permitted to be also advocates in their spare time. As a rule, meetings should never be allowed to become the main demand on an executive's time. Too many meetings always bespeak poor structure of jobs and the wrong organizational components. Too many meetings signify that work that should be in one job or in one component is spread over several jobs or several components. They signify that responsibility is diffused and that information isn't addressed to the people who need it. In one large company, the root cause of an epidemic of meetings was a traditional but obsolescent organization of the energy business. Large steam turbines, the company's traditional business since before 1900, were one division under their own management and with their own staff. During World War II, however, the company also went into aircraft engines and, as a result, had organized in another division concerned with aircraft and defense production a large jet engine capacity. Finally, there was an atomic energy division, really an offspring of the research labs, and still organizationally more or less tied to them. But today, these three power sources are no longer separate, each with its own market. Increasingly, they are becoming substitutes for, as well as complements to, each other. Each of the three is the most economical and most advantageous generating equipment for electric power under certain conditions. In this sense, the three are competitive. But by putting two of them together, one can also obtain performance capacities which no one type of equipment by itself possesses. What the company needed, clearly, was an energy strategy. It needed a decision whether to push all three types of generating equipment in competition with each other, whether to make one of the three the main business and consider the other two supplementary, or finally, whether to develop two of the three, and which two, as one energy package. It needed a decision how to divide available capital among the three. Above all, however, the energy business needed an organization which expressed the reality of one energy market producing the same end product, electric power, for the same customers. Instead, there were three components, each carefully shielded from the others by layers of organization, each having its own special folkways, rituals, and its own career ladders, and each blithely confident that it would get by itself 75% of the total energy business of the next decade. As a result, the three were engaged in a non-stop meeting for years. Since each reported to a different member of management, these meetings sucked in the entire top group. Finally, the three were cut loose from their original groups and put together into one organizational component under one manager. There's still a good deal of infighting going on, and the big strategy decisions still have to be made, but at least there's understanding now as to what these decisions are. At least top management no longer has to chair and referee every meeting, and total meeting time is a fraction of what it used to be. 4. The last major time waster is malfunction in information. The administrator of a large hospital was plagued for years by telephone calls from doctors asking him to find a bed for one of their patients who should be hospitalized. The admissions people knew that there was no empty bed, yet the administrator almost invariably found a few. The admissions people simply weren't informed immediately when a patient was discharged. The floor nurse knew, of course, and so did the people in the front office who presented the bill to the departing patient.
The admissions people, however, got a bed count made every morning at 5 a.m., while the great majority of patients were being sent home in mid-morning after the doctors had made the rounds. It didn't take genius to put this right. All it needed was an extra carbon copy of the chit that goes from the floor nurse to the front office.
Even worse, but equally common, is information in the wrong form. Manufacturing businesses typically suffer from production figures that have to be translated before operating people can use them. They report averages, that is, they report what the accountants need. Operating people, however, usually need not the averages but the range and the extremes, product mix and production fluctuations, length of runs, and so on. To get what they need, they must either spend hours each day adapting the averages or build their own secret accounting organization. The accountant has all the information, but no one as a rule has thought of telling him what's needed. Time-wasting management defects such as overstaffing, malorganization, or malfunctioning information can sometimes be remedied fast. At other times, it takes long, patient work to correct them. The results of such work are, however, great, and especially in terms of time gained.
Consolidating discretionary time. The executive who records and analyzes his time and then attempts to manage it can determine how much he has for his important tasks. How much time is there that is discretionary, that is, available for the big tasks that will really make a contribution?
Working day, if consolidated in large time units, is usually enough to get the important things done, but even 3/4 of the working day are useless if they're only available as 15 minutes here or half an hour there. The final step in time management is therefore to consolidate the time that record and analysis show as normally available and under the executive's control. There are a good many ways of doing this. Some people, usually senior men, work at home 1 day a week. This is a particularly common method of time consolidation for editors or research scientists. Other men schedule all the operating work, the meetings, reviews, problem sessions, and so on, for 2 days a week. For example, Monday and Friday, and set aside the mornings of the remaining days for consistent, continuing work on major issues. This was how the bank president handled his time. Monday and Friday he had his operating meetings, saw senior executives on current matters, was available to important customers, and so on. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday afternoons were left unscheduled for whatever might come up, and something, of course, always did, whether urgent personnel problems, a surprise visit by one of the bank's representatives from abroad, or by an important customer, or a trip to Washington. But in the mornings of these 3 days, he scheduled the work on the major matters in chunks of 90 minutes each. Another fairly common method is to schedule a daily work period at home in the morning. One of the most effective executives in Professor Soon Carlson's study, which we just discussed, spent 90 minutes each morning before going to work in a study without telephone at home. Even if this means working very early so as to get to the office on time, it's preferable to the most popular way of getting to the important work, taking it home in the evening and spending 3 hours after dinner on it. By that time, most executives are too tired to do a good job. Certainly those of middle age or older are better off going to bed earlier and getting up earlier, and the reason why working home nights is so popular is actually its worst feature. It enables an executive to avoid tackling his time and its management during the day. But the method by which one consolidates one's discretionary time is far less important than the approach. Most people tackle the job by trying to push the secondary, the less productive matters, together, thus clearing, so to speak, a free space between them. This doesn't lead very far, however. One still gives priority in one's mind and in one's schedule to the less important things, the things that have to be done even though they contribute little. As a result, any new time pressure is likely to be satisfied at the expense of the discretionary time and of the work that should be done in it. Within a few days or weeks, the entire discretionary time will then be gone again, nibbled away by new crises, new immediacies, new trivia. Effective executives start out by estimating how much discretionary time they can realistically call their own. Then they set aside continuous time in the appropriate amount, and if they find later that other matters encroach on this reserve, they scrutinize their record again and get rid of some more time demands from less than fully productive activities. They know that, as has been said before, one rarely overprunes. And all effective executives control their time management perpetually. They not only keep a continuing log and analyze it periodically, they set themselves deadlines for the important activities based on their judgment of their discretionary time.
One highly effective man I know keeps 2 such lists, one of the urgent and one of the unpleasant things that have to be done, each with a deadline. When he finds his deadline slipping, he knows his time is again getting away from him. Time is the scarcest resource, and unless it's managed, nothing else can be managed. The analysis of one's time, moreover, is the one easily accessible and yet systematic way to analyze one's work and to think through what really matters in it. Know thyself, the old prescription for wisdom, is almost impossibly difficult for mortal men,
but everyone can follow the injunction, know thy time, if he wants to, and be well on the road toward contribution and effectiveness.